Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we're jumping into the Avengers, we're jumping back into the Avengers, and this is actually kind of a one-shot comic, but this is interesting, right? Because I've been getting a lot of questions from people who are asking where this particular story fits in with regards to what's going on in the Iron Man comics. I'm not really sure that it does, and Marvel hasn't really seemed to consolidate the two things, right? Like when this takes place chronologically to the other one, we can kind of assume beforehand, or maybe it's after. Again, it's just kind of one of those weird things, right? Because if you guys recall from the Avengers comics, Tony Stark's time displaced 1 million years before the modern day. In the Iron Man comics, Tony Stark is an AI, right? And like he's leading this artificial intelligence revolt against like the current era, right? But then you go and you read the Avengers comics and he's 1 million years in the past, right? So in terms of when these two take place, I don't entirely know. And honestly, I'm not really concerned with reconciling the two. At this point, I'm just kind of going with the flow and eventually it'll be explained or it won't, I don't know. But what this does is this initially picks up kind of in the past, right? And it's kind of cool to see Jason Aaron do this. And this is something you would kind of expect to see in the Iron Man comics, but we're not. It picks up in the past and it almost kind of builds off a little bit with regards to the secret origin of Tony Stark from Kieran Gillen's run. But the idea is that Tony essentially kind of, has these X-ray contact lenses and ends up sneaking into this sort of basement in his parents' house, where there's this kind of gathering of all these super wealthy people. And as you would expect, and as most people believe, at least the conspiracy theorists do when it comes to like the ultra wealthy, that they're all just part of some giant cult. But nonetheless, with this particular bunker here, what this is basically all these people who are kind of gathered together and then doing whatever super wealthy people do, right? And they're kind of, giving themselves up, or, and initially this kind of conversation of, what those who are looking to make an offering, come forward. What do you have to offer? And some of them say like, we have to offer our bodies, right? We have to offer our flesh. And it's kind of like, no, the master has already has that. What else do you have to offer? And they say, we offer our souls, right? And then of course somebody comes out in a big red cloak. And then with Tony Stark watching it all, when the cloak head is taken down, that basically it's a person dressed up as the devil, right? And for the way this is done, it's kind of in twofold. The first is to kind of be foreshadowing of what we're going to see in the rest of the story. And then the other part of it is it just scared the heck out of Tony Stark when he was a little kid. And it's something that he never forgot. But what this does is it kind of jumps, a few weeks ago with regards to Tony Stark being 1 million years ago, right? And so initially he immediately comes into conflict with the Avengers 1 million. Now, this is something easy to overlook, but it's actually something that's hugely important. And the reason why is because you've basically got Starbrand 1 million, you've got Ghost Rider 1 million, you've got Odin, and you've got the Phoenix Force. Now, the Phoenix Force doesn't directly fight Tony Stark, but instead, over the course of a single page, you have him face off against Ghost Rider, you have him face off against Starbrand, and then you have him face off against Odin. And he's able to hold his own against all three of them. And that's a huge thing, right? That's a huge moment because Tony Stark has never really historically been depicted as like the most powerful Avenger ever, right? He's the smartest of all the Avengers, but he's never really been depicted as the most powerful of all the Avengers ever. And even then with his intelligence, you get kind of a mixed bag, right? If you go and you read Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, Reed Richards states on multiple occasions, there are things that I don't know that I hit Tony Stark up for, right? Because the guy's the best person when it comes to developing machinery, different things like that. During Secret Wars, for example, from 1984, the technology that Tony Stark used for his Iron Man suit that he gave to James Rhodes was far beyond anything that like Reed Richards had imagined creating, right? So like in a lot of ways, when it comes to building things, Tony Stark's way beyond Reed. That's why it's difficult to make a hierarchy of who the most intelligent person is because it's contextual and it goes from one story to the next. But being able to hold his own against like Odin and against Starbrand and against Ghost Rider is a pretty big thing. Now, you could make an argument that they weren't fighting to kill him, that they were fighting to basically, put him down and then ask questions or whatever. But from what we've seen with Avengers 1 million, they don't really fight to ask questions. They fight to kill, right? So they're pretty hardcore. So we can basically just kind of look at this and say that like Tony Stark managed to hold his own against all of the Avengers 1 million single-handedly, which is a big thing. That's a huge moment. But ultimately, he's met with the arrival of the Phoenix Force. Now, the Phoenix Force, immediately recognizes Tony Stark and knows who he is. Now, on the surface, part of this is because of the fact that the Phoenix Force reads the mind of Tony and then realizes he was sent here by some kind of power, but he wasn't summoned here by them, right? And so the Phoenix Force really kind of knows what's going on, but isn't saying anything. Now, for those of you guys who are probably asking how, it's the nature of the Phoenix Force, right? Remember, the Phoenix is an omniversal entity, right? It's all throughout everything. And there's a facsimile of itself in every single universe that exists out there. But the Phoenix represents all life that has ever, currently does, and will ever exist, meaning the Phoenix Force exists all throughout time and space. And so presumably, it's like the way that Dr. Manhattan sees time, right? Dr. Manhattan sees everything happening all at the same time. The Phoenix Force can largely be assumed to be the same way, right? The long and short of this is that Tony Stark is basically sent away by the Phoenix because he's essentially going to undergo these kind of trials and tribulations that are essentially going to test his character. What the motivation is behind that, we don't know. But the first thing to pop up is a woman who basically provides him with a kind of food, right? Tony Stark turns it down, but then after her come more women, and every day there's more and more women. After that, when he turns them down, then come various cavemen bearing clubs, and of course he turns them down as well, but ultimately gets into a bit of a fight with them, but again is able to kind of hold his own. But one thing to understand is the energy of Tony Stark's suit is not limitless, right? It's not like it's powered by the sun or something like that. It would make more sense if it was, because no matter where he was in the time stream, he'd always have energy for his suit. But it may be one of those things where the sun just doesn't have enough power to power a suit, right? Like solar energy just isn't enough to power the kind of equipment that his suit has, which would be kind of cool actually, and pretty impressive if that were the case. But at the end of the day, it's one of these things where he's constantly kind of visited by these various presences until ultimately he's visited by a snake. And the snake really kind of has this interesting way of talking, you know, where basically it addresses him as Tony Stark, and he says, I'm a very old friend, you know, and Tony's like, I have no idea who you are. And he's like, well, we haven't really met yet, you know, but we will. You know, I'm kind of beyond time, you know, with these sort of things. And that's where it gets really interesting, because for those of you guys who are familiar with Marvel Comics, who have been reading for a long time, just going by the speech bubbles, you immediately know who this is. I picked up on it like that. I was like, I know exactly who this is. But it's one of these things where he's just kind of like, you know, he asks the question, do you know how the smartest person, you know, how someone becomes the smartest person in the world? Like, how did you get to where you were, right? How did you get to being super intelligent? You know, like there was a price that was paid for this, right? You don't know what that price was, and you don't know how much it cost Howard Stark, but it cost him a price. But the result, he says, is basically, you belong to me, right? No matter what era, you will always belong to me. And it's kind of a crazy thing, because Tony Stark looks at this, kind of hears what's going on, and then rejects the serpent and sends it flying away. But after that, suddenly all these things start popping up, right? One of the big things to happen here is you have this gorilla that shows up wielding the Power Stone, right? The Power Infinity Stone. How it got it is never explained to us, but we're explicitly told this gorilla is wielding the Power Stone. Now, it absolutely pummels Tony Stark, basically leaves his armor almost completely and totally drained and destroyed, and then leaves, right? Doesn't really kill him, it just leaves. The idea, I guess, is to leave him for dead. But those of you guys who are looking at this, you guys are beginning to notice a trend that Tony Stark is being met with all this temptation, right? He's being met by this idea of, you know, him being tempted to do things, to get involved in things, right? To take part in various things. That if he gives in to this kind of temptation, that ultimately things can go south, right? And so with these serpents continually showing back up again, right? Continually popping back up, being resurrected after they die, that Tony Stark essentially assembles, you know, takes all these different icicles and then assembles like the Iron Man ice armor, which is actually pretty cool. He uses some of the mechanical components from his existing Iron Man suit and then just kind of fuses it all together into just one big ice armor, like one big ice suit. But ultimately, you know, it's one of these things where like this presence kind of appears out of nowhere yet again and essentially says like, you know, you will know well enough, or like, you know exactly who I am. And he says, hello, Tony. And that's when it's basically revealed that it's Howard Stark. And that's kind of the crazy thing, because what we end up learning is that in this instance, back in Tony's flashback, when he was a little kid and he saw the person who was wearing the devil mask, that he recognized it was his father, that his father was part of this kind of demonic cult, more or less. But when Tony goes to attack him, starts shooting, you know, icicles into this guy's chest, which is kind of crazy. Of course, he just picks him out and throws him away. And that's when we start to realize there's more going on here, right? Like there's a lot more taking place here. And ultimately, when this guy reveals who he really is, when Tony shoots him in the face with an icicle, the guy basically comes, you know, stands back up again, resurrects himself, and then reveals himself to be Mephisto. And that's why all these different temptations have been showing up to Tony, because the devil has been trying to get Tony to give in so that he can in turn receive Tony's soul. But that's the crazy thing about this, is because everything that Mephisto is essentially saying, that he already has the soul of Tony Stark, right? Like he already owns his soul. And what we end up finding out is that not only is Mephisto here, Mephisto is in possession of the Time Stone. So we don't know how he got it, right? And that's one of the important things to understand here. When it comes to the Infinity Stones, we're rarely ever told how it is that a person came into possession of them. One of the only real instances that we have from that is like when Reed Richards, for example, assembled the Infinity Gauntlet during the events of Brian Michael Bendis's Illuminati storyline, or like when Thanos gained the Infinity Stones from Thanos' Quest storyline leading up into Infinity Infinity Gauntlet, which I think is kind of cool because it sort of gives this underlying theme that like the Infinity Stones are shifting hands all the time in Marvel Comics. It's just we never really know who's got one from one moment to the next, which I think is really cool. But using the power of the Time Stone, which Mephisto doesn't really need because he's so incredibly powerful, he ends up like sending Tony back to the modern era. And with that being the case, he immediately ends up landing in Las Vegas and basically ends up coming to this realization like he's back in the modern era. You know, he ends up, you know, tracking down Mephisto, who, you know, as far as we can tell, is still locked away in Las Vegas after the events of, what is it, Doctor Strange Damnation, I think it was. But Mephisto was essentially locked away in Vegas, like literally in like a cell, you know, he just could not escape from. But basically it's one of these things where it's kind of like Tony's like, you know, you're never gonna have my soul, that kind of a thing. Now, reading between the lines here, what seems to have gone on, what seems to have taken place, kind of building on Kieran Gillen's The Secret Origin of Tony Stark, is that those of you guys who remember that story, and if you don't, I'll have a link to the Iron Man playlist down in the description so you can kind of get caught up and know what we're talking about here. But in The Secret Origin of Tony Stark, essentially we learned that like the biological child of Howard and Maria is not Tony, that it's actually Arno. And Arno is legitimately super intelligent, right? His genes were modified during the gestation process so that he would be the smartest person in the world. But his genes were further modified by Howard and Maria because they didn't trust Recorder 451, who originally modified the genes. And ultimately their child, you know, Arno was born without the ability to basically use his body, right? He was born as a complete and total paraplegic or quadriplegic, really. His entire body was paralyzed with the exception of his head, right? I mean, you know, everything above the neck, he was fine. But the result of this is that Tony Stark was adopted in order to kind of maintain the cover and kind of keep Arno's existence secret. But we never really got an answer to the question how it is that Tony's just that damn smart. And initially we just kind of were left to this idea that he's just naturally that intelligent, right? He just has an aptitude, right? Learning at the knee of his father with all of his father's intelligence and all the resources of Stark Industries and the education he could have received, that basically he just was naturally gifted to these kind of things, right? But like graduating from MIT at like 14, 15 or 16 years old, whatever it is, you know, and that kind of stuff, that's beyond the normal scope of just a really, really good education bought by really wealthy parents, right? There's some kind of third element at play there, right? And what this does is it really kind of hints towards this idea that in order for Tony Stark to essentially become as intelligent as Arno was supposed to be, that basically Tony's soul was sold, right? That's really kind of seems to be the case. Either Howard sold his own soul or Tony's soul was sold later on down the line to Mephisto by Howard Stark. And so what this really points the idea to is that Tony is doomed to hell for all eternity, right? Like that's the way that works. When it comes to Mephisto, when you make a barter with Mephisto, usually he tricks you and then you don't really even get what you asked for. You get some variation of it and you're usually worse off than you were before. But regardless, once you die, Mephisto takes your soul to his realm in hell, right? That's where all those people go. That's where Dr. Doom's mother went. That's where all those people go to, right? Those individuals who barter with Mephisto and die, their souls are taken by him directly. And the kind of indication here is either that Howard or Tony or both will end up going to that location. Not only that, and that's kind of the crazy thing that goes on here, you have this kind of disembodied voice out of nowhere that asks Mephisto, did you really believe that Tony was going to like come here and like talk to you and reason with you and understand you and possibly even, you know, make a deal with you or anything like that? And ultimately Mephisto says, I never intended for him to make a deal. I never intended for anything to do that. What I've done here is I've sown doubt and fear, and this will ripple outward and presumably affect, you know, it'll cross multiple worlds and it'll affect a multitude of different people. It kind of seems to be a bigger game at foot. We don't really know what this bigger game is, but what we do know is that the person talking to Mephisto is actually none other than Howard Stark himself. Now, whether or not this is really Howard Stark, we don't know. It may be one of these things where it's just somebody masquerading as him, or it's just like a projection or something along those lines, but it really seems to actually be him. It actually really seems to be Howard Stark, who's somehow either back or resurrected from the dead or something along those lines. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.